Well, good afternoon, everyone. Stuart Holliday here, President of Meridian International Center. We're delighted to have you joining my good friend Ben Chang in this program on diplomacy in the Zoom era. It's going to be a very interesting discussion. Meridian, as most of you know, is a center for diplomacy, leadership, and culture. We seek to strengthen U.S. engagement with the world. We've been around 60 years. And one of my favorite programs, which really was initiated by incredible leaders like Ben, is the Rising Leaders Council. And the Rising Leaders Council brings together mid-career professionals, and actually they're very senior professionals, to exchange ideas and discuss some of the most important issues of the day. And these members are from various different sectors, and it creates a very interesting dynamic. And many of them are in key decision-making roles in our international affairs landscape, business landscape, diplomatic landscape. And today's program is particularly special for me. It's a little bit of a Georgetown reunion. Not only is Ben, who is also a former colleague when I had the opportunity to serve the United States as our ambassador at the UN Security Council, with Ben up there helping me not say things that were inappropriate and to advance our policies. But also across the street was Stephane Dujarric, who at the time, he's now reprising his role, was the lead public affairs official at the United Nations. And it was fun to work with Stephane because we also were classmates and hallmates freshman year at Georgetown. And it is interesting to see how, careers and lives have evolved. But we're delighted to have you today. And Ben, I'd like to thank you and the Rising Leaders Council for everything you do, and turn it over to you to introduce the panel and take it from here.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Holliday. And it is indeed good to see you and to bring a little bit of the band back together here during these very disrupted times. A big thanks, as you said, to the broader team at Meridian International. In particular, Megan Devlin, who's the head of communications and marketing for the center, who serves as our invaluable Rising Leaders Council liaison. Thanks to the speakers today, whom you'll meet in just a moment, and fellow RLC members who are tuning in right now and who've contributed to the ideas behind this event. Indeed, speaking of disruption, often the RLC events, as Ambassador Holliday noted, bring together these different stakeholders and different sectors in person for dinners or other convenings at Meridian, a spot that is close to many of our hearts in DC. And during these times, we're having to find other ways to convene not only our membership, but expand and open our doors up. And this is an example, today's event, of how ideally we can find ways to broaden our conversations. We're going to pack a lot in over the next hour, so I will be brief. Which I recall from my days around the Security Council table with Ambassador Holliday, when someone would say in diplomatic parlance, "I'm going to be brief," that often meant the opposite, but I will try to hold true to that. The topic of the day, of course, which permeates our lives, is disruption, and in particular, disruption of diplomacy and the traditional practice of diplomacy, and how diplomats and those international civil servants who staff diplomacy are adjusting to this new era. Given Meridian's focus, as Ambassador Holliday detailed, we thought this was particularly trenchant for today. My role as moderator is to help facilitate the questions for the panelists and our speaker, and also field your questions. So there should be a Q&A function set up on your Zoom screen, and I will be keeping an eye on those questions as they come in. So please do share your thoughts. Given that I hung up my diplomat hat a few years ago, though not the bow tie, some of you who know my work attire will recall, I am in higher ed now, but diplomacy is always close to my heart. I served as a Foreign Service Officer for the US State Department for over 18 years. And while currently serving as Deputy Vice President for Communications and University Spokesperson at Princeton, hence my backdrop, public service over this shoulder will always be close to my heart. And so having an opportunity to bring a conversation like this together is quite warming. We will first hear from Stephane, as Ambassador Holliday noted, and then after a question or two, bring in our panel, as well as a special guest. So let's start by introducing Stephane. Stephane and I have known each other since our early, younger diplomatic days in the 90s, when he was then spokesperson for UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. He has served a total of 3 secretaries general, including Ban Ki-moon, and currently, of course, serves as the spokesman for Antonio Guterres. Stephane knows the UN system inside and out. Not only does he rock the mic at the UN podium day to day, but he has run all of TV, radio, and photo for the UN operation, and he also has led communications at the UN Development Program. His world travels started before his time at the UN, however, when he was a journalist with ABC News covering the globe. Of course, as noted, also a fellow Hoya and proud graduate of Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. So Stephane, over to you to open us up.
Great. Ben, thank you very much. And you can be my spokesperson anytime. Stuart, thank you for hosting us. Thank you for organizing this. And it's absolutely great to see you again, even though virtually after all these years, whether at the UN and in the halls at Georgetown. So thanks again for inviting me. And I want to spend a few minutes just talking about how we at the UN have adapted to this new reality. Now, of course, I can talk about the way the UN itself works, the secretariat, the agencies, but I will let the distinguished diplomats, 3 diplomats we have here on the panel, speak to the impact of their work on a more bilateral basis. The UN, just like any other organization, any company with a private company, public organization, we've had to adapt and do some crash learning in remote working when the Secretary General took the decision to shut down the campus in New York. And I'll just note that he took that decision rather early on in March, before the city itself had begun to shut down. We shut down before museums, before Broadway and other public spaces. And he did it not only out of an abundance of caution, because we wanted to be good neighbors, but I think also politically, the UN could not afford to become a hotspot within the hotspot that New York was fast becoming. And one could only imagine the headlines of our local tabloids if the UN had been responsible for bringing a lot of COVID cases in New York. And so almost overnight, we went from about 11,000 people coming into the campus every day, delegates, staff members, NGO, tourists, to about 150 people. And now it's back up to about 200, 300 who come into the building every day. So the building remains basically empty. But I can say proudly, and maybe surprisingly to some, that the Secretariat staff has met the challenge. Working like a lot of other organizations, working from living rooms, from kitchens in New York and around the world, we've been able to continue to deliver the critical work that the organization needs to deliver on and meet the challenges of this crisis, which is really hitting all the core mandates that the UN has, and really goes at the heart of what we are and what we're supposed to do. Our peacekeeping operations, our special political missions have adapted to working under new conditions, supporting the national authorities in the fight against the virus, in addition to delivering on their critical functions. Our 100,000 peacekeepers, our tens of thousands of humanitarian workers are not in lockdown. They're in the field working every day. And their work continues to be supported uninterrupted from headquarters. In addition, our country offices, which exist in about 166 places around the world, are also working with local governments to help put in place policies to help stem the virus and support the post-COVID recovery. As an example, the Secretary General really rallied the UN's global supply chain, and it's been put at the disposal of developing countries and middle-income countries. In a lot of parts of the African continent, the UN planes are the only ones flying, delivering personal protective devices, surgical masks, respirators, basic commodities, and we've reached now globally about 100 countries. Now, how we work, I think for the leadership and especially for the Secretary General, it's been all hands on deck, because not only because of the pandemic, but of the global diplomatic fallout from this pandemic, or, if I were to use a more precise word, the dysfunctionality of the international scene that has emerged as a result of the pandemic. So the Secretary General, he does come into the office and works from his office by phone, by video conference. I don't think he misses traveling to summits and other official conferences, though, of course, as we all know, very important work goes on in these conferences, especially, I would say, on the sidelines. I think what's been taken away from him is his ability to go to the field, which is where I've always seen him at his most invigorated and at his happiest. And not because he enjoys tragedy, but because it is an amazing opportunity for him to engage with the people that we are here to help, the people who benefit from the UN's humanitarian development work. And it's also a chance for him to interact with our colleagues who are in the front line. So that has been taken away, and I think it's a big it's a big thing that's been taken away from him, and I think has not been a positive impact. Now, obviously, the lockdown has had an impact on how we work at headquarters and how we support multilateral meetings and the member states, or the legislative bodies that work at the UN. But I think after some technical challenges like we have all faced, we're now able to support regular meetings of the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, both virtually and sometimes in person. The Security Council met in person for the first time earlier this week. The big challenge for us has been on the IT side, because we have issues of interpretation, IT safety. I think it's easy to imagine the reluctance of some of our member states for installing external software on the computers of their ambassadors and their diplomats. And the headline, the title of this talk is Zoom diplomacy, but the meetings that we've been hosting, whether General Assembly, Security Council, or in fact not hosted on Zoom. We've been discouraged from using Zoom, so we're using other platforms. So, in the sense, on the formal part of the work that we have to do, delivering on humanitarian, peacekeeping, political missions, hosting member states meetings, we've risen, we've risen to the challenge posed by the lockdown. I think the more difficult part is on the informal part of our work, and that's been a big challenge. Speaking personally, in order for me to do my work successfully as a spokesperson, I really have to be a journalist within the organization, asking unpleasant questions of my colleagues, trying to squeeze information from a bureaucracy to meet the needs of my clients, who are the journalists. And so I still have my daily meetings with the Secretary General, obviously on video conference most of the time, and we're in touch as needed. But what I can't do anymore, what's missing for me, is my ability to basically roam the halls of the building, pop in my head into people's offices, and get a sense of what's actually going on and the trends and the discussions that people are having on a much more informal basis. And the same applies to our resident journalists. We have about 200 journalists that are accredited full-time to the UN, who have their offices here. And the way they gather information is, in normal times, is to hang out outside the Security Council, to buttonhole ambassador, have a coffee with a diplomat in the delegates lounge. So, it's important to kind of imagine the UN campus on the East River as a sort of a unique biosphere that's populated with UN staff, national diplomats, NGOs, and of course journalists. And the journalists are sort of the pollinator bees of the biosphere. And so the lockdown has stopped this sort of informal pollination of information, and we've all had to adapt it. Now, I know ambassadors who used to do in-person, off-the-record briefing to journalists are doing them by video conference and by Zoom or whatever platform, but it's not the same as an in-person chat. Now, the other challenge that we face, I think, is a mental health issue for our staff. You know, by the very nature of the UN and the kind of people that work at the UN, we have many colleagues who are in New York alone, sometimes far away from family and friends. Some of them arrived just before the lockdown. And I think, Ben, in our conversations, as you put it, they're far away from home, but stuck at home. And so as managers, we have a big responsibility to check in on the staff, to make sure their mental health is okay, to make sure they are feeling included in the work that we do. And that, I think, as this lockdown will continue, that will become a growing challenge for us. So our focus now for the UN as a whole is on preparing for the General Assembly in September, the high-level week, which will be nothing like we've had in the past, obviously. It will be, in fact, mostly virtual. Heads of states will send in video messages, which will be broadcast in the General Assembly Hall. We expect to have maybe one representative from each country sitting physically in the hall. So there will be a physical presence. The Secretary General will likely deliver his message live from the podium. So very few side events. It'll be a brand new world. But I think we as the Secretariat will continue to work hard to support the member states in their efforts to organize a General Assembly, and will continue to adapt our ways of working in order to successfully fulfill our global mandate. So I will leave it at that, Ben, and I'm happy to take questions from you and from any of the other participants.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Stephane. And I found this, as much as I feel I know the UN and the hallways and corridors, the picture you just painted was extremely riveting and informative. As you noted, large institutions, bureaucracies, companies of all sizes, we're all facing very similar challenges and finding ways to adapt. Indeed, I'm looking at the Q&A function and also to our panelists who I know have not been introduced yet, but if anyone has a question, please float it. In the meantime, Stephane, I'm quite taken by your description of the biosphere on the East River and noting that one of the first considerations as the gravity of COVID started to sink in was that the Secretary General viewed the UN as a part of the New York City community. So that duality of both being this contained biosphere, but also a part, a neighbor, a resident of New York, I think is so important to remember. You also talked about just taking care of staff as managers, and whether that's a small diplomatic mission or a large institution like your own. Could you share with us, and you don't need to name names per se, but where have you seen some of the more innovative or ingenious approaches to any of the above, managing staff or creating informal moments when the normal opportunities aren't there? Have you seen examples from the last couple of months in your circles where you thought, oh, this is something that was an innovative approach that might be worth sharing with others?
Well, I think we've all gone through phases, I think, in our professional and our personal lives. In the beginning, it was kind of fun. You had the quarantinis and all of that, and then that kind of gets old. So to me, at least speaking for me, it's about consistent contact. I think in the beginning, we were all trying to have Zoom calls all the time. But for me, how I manage the staff is really to try to do a couple of group check-ins a day to keep people motivating. I mean, in order to be successful in getting the daily press briefing, it's a full teamwork, and I don't do it alone. And so it's very important to to check in with the staff twice a day, to check in individually with people. If you see a staff member that's kind of lagging for whatever reason, to reach out to people individually to make sure they're doing okay. I think everybody is struggling, whether they're living alone or in close quarters with a large family. It's a struggle in terms of figuring out what's personal time, what's work time, and we're all learning. So to me, it's really about. I mean, maybe others have been very innovative, but for me, it's really about consistency and making sure. I mean, to use a quote that's too often used, you leave no one behind in your team, in a sense.
We have a couple questions now from our audience, and I'll do my best to maybe synthesize a little bit. Stephane, you have talked about operational changes, procedure. In light of the adaptation that's going on, what changes do you think might stick? That is to say, that should we see light at the end of the tunnel and some resumption of normal procedures, what operational changes or what procedures do you think might stay, or any reformulation of procedures that might stay with us over the long term?
I think one thing
is plan operations. Sorry,
I think one thing is probably a drop in travel. I mean, there will be travel that resumes, but I think it's clear now that a lot of the travel, probably that we've all done for professional basis, could have been is a bit redundant, right? So I imagine there'll be less. There will be less travel, and hopefully a streamlining of procedures, and also using the collaborative software we've all been given in different organizations that has worked out very well. I mean, at least from my end, and I think really bringing organizations into the 21st century in how we collaborate in order to get things done.
Thanks, Stephane. I have a feeling we'll pick up that theme in the panel as well. Let's do one more question specifically for you, and I want to remind everyone that you will be, and thank you for having the time, you'll be joining the panel as well, so we can continue this line of conversation. We have a question regarding the SDGs and the goal of 2030. Given all the disruption that we have seen, I know there's been discussion about environmental targets and so on. When it comes to the SDGs as a whole, what are expectations about meeting them? And specifically, and again, I think this is something we can also pick up in the panel, where can the private sector come in and perhaps provide some accelerant or support when it comes to the achievement of the SDGs?
This could be a whole hour discussion, but to put it very, very simply, we're extremely worried, because even before this, it was clear that some indicators would not be met. But the COVID has laid bare the inequalities of this world, things that a lot of us suspected, but the curtain has been lifted. You look at issues. I mean, I'll just choose two of them on education. It is clear that with so many students not being able to go to school, when schools reopen in places within the framework of an economic crisis, a lot of children will not go back to school. It's clear that of those children who won't go back to school, most likely the girls will not go back to school. So that will have an impact on educations and girls, on education as a whole, on women's empowerment, women's education. On the climate issue, we're really at a crossroads. I think we've all benefited and enjoyed the clear blue skies. What the Secretary General is doing is pushing for all these financial packages that are being designed, whether in the developing world or in the developed world, that we use this opportunity not to double up on coal, not to double up on fossil fuel, but to really go deep into green investment, into renewable energies. So, those are two that will have. We could see a very. We're at the risk of seeing a negative impact. But I think across the SDGs. We're worried on issues of human rights. I mean, you're looking at, the surveillance that is being put in place for tracing that could be used for nefarious purposes. We're seeing a lot of countries where freedom of speech, the space for for NGO, civil society is being shrunk, all in the name of fighting COVID. So we have to make sure that the recovery pushes us in the right direction. To put it simply, the private sector has a huge role to play because governments can't do it alone, just as a matter of fact, and don't have the resources to do it alone. So it's important that the private sector plays its role in terms of investing in the right way for the recovery.
Thanks. That was a Herculean effort, I know, to distill what, as you pointed out, could be a whole separate conversation. So Meridian friends, let's take a note. Maybe that's the follow-on. We have questions from others, including old friend Michael, Sophia, I know your hand is up. If you'll allow me, let's bring in the other panelists. I'll do brief introductions, hold your questions, and let's see if we can visit those then. So on that score, let me start by introducing Gerry Diaz Bartolome, a fellow RLC member. Gerry, good to see you. Though you're wearing a tie, you're making me feel very formal here, but thanks for holding up the style points for our crew. A career diplomat since 2000, Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Argentina currently. I was going to say here in Washington, but in Washington, D.C. Between stints in Brazil and Buenos Aires, Gerry also served at the Mission of Argentina to the United Nations and also knows Stephane from those days. So it is a small diplomatic world. Our other panelist, fellow RLC member, Hreinn Palsson, who since 2017 has served as the Deputy Chief of Mission and Defense Attaché at the Embassy of Iceland in Washington, D.C. With the Icelandic Ministry of Foreign Affairs since 2005, has served in such far-flung places as Reykjavik, Shanghai, Moscow, and Norfolk, Virginia. They all featured in his diplomatic journeys. And last but certainly not least, for this segment of our discussion, my co-conspirator in the ideation and planning of this event, Kezia McKeague, who is currently director at McLarty Associates, advising clients on, may I say, all things Latin America, but specifically Argentina and Cuba. Up until a few months ago, was really splitting her time between Argentina and Washington. I know longs to go back to what is probably a second home, advising multinational companies across a range of sectors. Prior to McLarty, served with the Council of the Americas on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And fun fact, her family hails from Cuba and New Zealand. So thank you for joining the conversation. I will immediately launch into some starter questions. And let's go back to the top. Gerry, when in Washington, on the diplomatic circuit, the Embassy of Argentina and the Embassy of Iceland, among others, features prominently for all the cultural programming that you and your team have been doing. What has it been like to translate that programming to a virtual setting now? You've been making some great headway. And then what is the difference between planning that versus a traditional bilateral meeting? How have you been making that transition for your embassy?
Well, thank you very much, man. Hi to my RLC colleagues, Stephane and Ambassador Holliday. Thank you for hosting us. Well, we had to adapt. Many of the issues I was planning to deal with have been raised by Stephane. Even from a bilateral perspective, we share most of those same challenges. And when the embassy team, we came to the conclusion that due to the pandemic, nothing is the same and nothing will be the same in the near future. So we had to go digital. And we had many staff meetings to discuss the available platforms we had, the programs, designing tools. We got them. We got great support from our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to acquire those new elements, digital tools. We practiced a lot. We did mock events to rehearse, and we started redesigning our whole programs, the cultural program, for example, online. We came up with a very interesting online cultural program. I would differentiate basically between two big kinds of diplomacies: the traditional bilateral official government to government meetings. Online are basically, of course, they are different. There are many aspects which are not the same, but conversations may still be conversations, even if you don't have the personal feel or the sidelines, or you still can pass on messages. Of course, there are some constraints like the lack of the records or the as I said, the personal feel, but that is workable, always in the hope that you will finally end up seeing your interlocutor in the near future. Of course, it's much easier to have these bilateral meetings with people you're acquainted with than building up a new relationship from scratch. But as far as the other kinds of diplomacies, cultural, commercial, the challenge was bigger because a great deal of cultural diplomacy has to do with again, the personal feel, the gathering in our embassy for a concert, tango lessons, or wine tasting, or a film festival. The personal meeting is key. That's where you have the connections, and you meet, you chat with a movie director or a curator, and you can interest them in your country, your culture, and think ahead. Well, without that, we had to adapt, and we've been pretty successful. We even had, of course, it's not the same to have tango lessons in person at our beautiful embassy building than have them online, but we could still make that. And we had many premieres on very interesting Argentine movies online, and people are actually eager to see what the program brings. Commercial diplomacy may be also challenging, of course, depending on which angle you're working with. You can always come up with a webinar to promote the tourism gems of Argentina, or how our companies are doing in robotics, and try to sell Argentina in those fields. But wine tastings are not the same. We still make them, but you need to spot a retailer or a wine distributor first to make sure that they will, give the proper wines to the stakeholders and the consumers get them in time, so that we can have the winery representative online at a certain time to explain and walk the audience through very slowly, and without that personal feel where you see their faces, their expressions. So it's been very challenging, but we've been doing a great deal of events, and modestly we've gone digital and pretty successfully, I must say.
Thanks, Gerry. I appreciate that. And if I can pull a couple threads from what you said and actually pass the mic to Kezia, it seems like a natural extension. One of the things Gerry talked about was in many respects, high touch nature of diplomacy. Kezia, so much of your work involves interacting directly with clients, helping them interface with governments. How do you adapt to that situation? What kind of advice would one give in this current environment that we're in?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's great to be on here with good friends. Look, we're learning as we go. Just as the pandemic has forced new constraints on the conduct of traditional diplomacy, so it has on the government affairs profession, or how companies engage with governments. The private sector can't meet with government officials in person. We can't make foreign trips. We can't organize in-person events, the bread and butter of what is really a face-to-face business. Speaking from my vantage point at McLarty Associates, which is a global strategy firm that was a real pioneer in the field of private sector diplomacy when it was founded more than 20 years ago, we do a range of services for clients in diverse sectors, including intel gathering and political analysis, strategy development and execution, helping clients in more than 112 countries all over the world. So in the first few weeks of the pandemic, we were probably working harder than ever. We were helping our clients respond to just this incredible pace of external political and regulatory developments, from factories being shut down to definitions of essential versus non-essential businesses, new export controls and trade restrictions across key markets, the disruption of supply chains, helping with evacuation of key personnel. But after that real initial rush of firefighting kind of work, I personally struggled a little bit to stay connected in the same way I had before the pandemic. And some governments, foreign governments, were slower than others to engage online, understandably so, given the unprecedented challenges, the crisis management we were all dealing with. Some of the traditional tools of private sector diplomacy we're still using, right? So associations, business associations have adapted very rapidly with virtual events, though I would say that I think some of them are struggling to recruit sponsorship from the private sector. So they may be struggling financially in the future because companies may be less interested in providing funding for a virtual roundtable. While those roundtables are still very useful, they're much more scripted. I actually just got off an hour-long meeting with an Argentine minister, for example, and my question was posed to him, but it was posed by the president of the association, and there was no interaction back and forth that would have occurred if I had been seated at a table with him in person. So what's more challenging, I think, as this has been a theme of our conversation, is what typically gets done on the margins and the corridors. You can't do a pull aside for a meeting virtually like you would in an in-person roundtable. I was somebody who found that I wasn't really doing my job well if I was on the computer all day. I was out getting coffees. I like spending a lot of time on the ground, particularly in Buenos Aires, since I specialize in Argentina, getting coffees with government officials, gathering intelligence. All of that was extremely useful to the work I was doing with clients in a variety of sectors. Something I have noticed is that while we can maintain relationships that pre-existed the pandemic, it's much harder to build new relationships. So those who work in Latin America, for example, know that a lot of work can get done very effectively on WhatsApp. So if I already have a relationship with a government official and can send a quick WhatsApp message, it's so much more efficient. If I don't already have that relationship, it's going to be very difficult to build from my living room in Washington. Another tool that the private sector has always used in engaging with governments is leveraging international meetings. So we've already talked about the upcoming UN General Assembly, which will be virtual for the first time in 75 years. And in past years, every September, I and a lot of company representatives would flock to New York. It was one of the busiest weeks of the year because of all the sideline events that took place, hosted by think tanks, government associations, all the bilateral meetings that took place between companies and heads of state that traveled to New York. That we're trying to figure out how with a lot of our clients, how are we going to still in some way take advantage of UNGA, this virtual UNGA, what that will look like. In some cases for companies, it's being creative about thought leadership. So sponsoring a virtual roundtable around a particular topic. There are some associations that are doing major virtual fora, but it's a challenge. So as I said, we're learning as we go. There's a quote I like by the renowned journalist and war correspondent Edward Murrow, which says, "The really crucial link in the international communication chain is the last 3 feet, which is bridged by personal contact, one person talking to another." So the question is, how effectively will we continue to do that with our new normal?
That's a great note to hand off. I will say to Hreinn, though, perhaps we now have an update to the Murrow quote, which is the last 3 feet as long as you're wearing a mask. Hreinn, so many themes touched on here that I know you and the foreign ministry have been looking at. Let's pretend, Hreinn, no one else is on the screen here, that we don't have over 100 folks tuning in. Just lean your ear into me a second. How do we figure out navigating diplomacy when so much is set off the record these days, when we're worried that if we're on a Zoom together, other people might be listening. Stephane touched on this a little bit. What have your studies and your journeys through this been about that? What Kezia said is that informal contact. What's the state of play when it comes to what can we say in confidence and what really can't we say in confidence?
I thank you for having me, and thank you to Stephane and Ambassador Holliday and the LC members and everybody who's tuning in. It's an interesting question, and I think in one of our preparatory discussions for this event, I think Stephane quote Stephane that he said, everything is on the record when you're going through this meeting, when you're going through the Zoom. You really can't have anything off the record. You don't know who's looking. You don't know who's recording. I work with a lot of the politics. I work a lot with security issues while here in DC. And so many of my conversations through the Zoom end with a quote, well, I'll tell you over a cup of coffee a little bit later, what I actually, the background to all of this is. We can't, that is the hindrance. And a lot of what we do as diplomats is to add sort of context to a lot of things that are going on. My ambassadors have said, we don't write reports back home about the political situation in the United States. The Washington Post writes very good reports about the political situation in the United States, and everybody can read it on, on every day in the media. What we do is provide the background. And the background, you get the background from the personal conversations, from the private conversations that you can say, we had a discussion with a Biden person, we had a discussion with a Trump person, and they told us that this is this is where they're going with this. This is the reason for this policy being enacted. This is the context. This is the added value that we give to our capitals to understand better what's going on, to be able to take better decisions and more informed decisions. And unfortunately, under the current circumstances, this is very difficult. You are on the record when you're talking. You can't sort of give hints and nods and winks to guide you along with this thing. So that's it. You can, as my fellow panelists have mentioned, you can have open discussions and even more close discussions and more frequent discussions with people that you are already acquainted with, that you already have a network with, but they are still going to be limited. There are security issues by using this kind of medium. So that there is no way getting around it at the moment. And this is the deficiency that we have to try to work with.
Mm-hmm. Hreinn, thanks very much. I know we have a few really trenchant questions that have been sent in from places far and wide. We have one other speaker we're going to bring on now, and that is Violet Skiva, to introduce a topic that I think really needs to be covered. And then we will go to the queue of questions for the full panel. Violet, thank you so much for joining us. By way of quick introduction, Violet Skiva works as the first secretary for political and economic affairs at the Embassy of Malawi in Washington. Recipient of Meridian's Scholarship for Global Leaders in Digital Finance. You studied at the Harvard School of Government, which as a Princeton person, I'll still say, very good thing to have done. Little Ivy League humor there. Your background before being a diplomat is you worked in the banking sector in Malawi and for the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. And just picking up on that background that you bring to the conversation, can we talk about access to technology for a moment? One of the things that even the premise of our meeting implies is having the basic tools to conduct conversations in diplomacy via Zoom or Hreinn, what's the title of the report, any other Cisco, WebEx, Microsoft platform. But that presumes a lot. And it's important, and frankly, it's something we're looking at from the lens of higher education, and that is, in a certain way, and this I'm looking at the questions we receive from some people, digital diplomacy can level the playing field a lot. In other ways, it can highlight or exacerbate inequality. Would you mind picking up a little on that, for what you've seen, the challenges and opportunities in this so-called move to digital diplomacy?
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you, Meridian, for having me on this conversation. First is, when we talk about digital diplomacy, to me, I think it's a move from traditional diplomacy, because traditionally when you're conducting meetings, you want to have that personal conversation, the informal conversation with your counterparts or partners. normally when you are trying to agree on how to forge ahead with a certain issue, you may want to talk to your friend, maybe over coffee, and find out their perspective and agree on how you want to go ahead together. So in an online meeting, you don't have that chance. So it's really difficult to conduct meetings digitally as a diplomat. But again, what I found interesting in this digital environment is that we had elections in Malawi, and the international observers could not fly into the country. So this is a function that you cannot conduct online. You have to be on the ground to observe what is happening with the elections. So I found that it was the resident diplomats in Malawi that were relied upon to observe the elections and report back to their various countries on what was happening on the ground in Malawi. Yeah, maybe stop there for now.
I know there's a lot more to unpack there, but thank you for reminding us that much of diplomacy has no other option than to occur in person and on the ground. And the notion of election observation is an important reminder. So thanks for all the panelists for staying on. I realize the clock is ticking. So let me try to summarize a few of the questions that we've received. And flipping the switch a little bit on the idea of what can be said on or off the record, is there an element where this notion of Zoom diplomacy, online diplomacy, can actually be a force multiplier for transparency or trust, either in multilateral institutions or in the conduct of bilateral or commercial diplomacy? I want to bring in a question about civil society as well in a second, but let's take that issue of being a force multiplier for transparency in this digital environment. Who would like to take that?
I step in.
Thanks, Gerry.
Well, there's the notion that transparency would not be involved otherwise. That is the only thing that made me think that at the same time, I'm fully aware of the drawbacks and constraints that my colleagues were mentioning, and the off-the-record part of this Zoom diplomacy and the constraints we face. There's no personal touch, no face-to-face contact. But transparency, as I see it, should be something which is beyond digital diplomacy or not. It is part of our work. Some conversations need to be restricted for different purposes, political reasons, but it's not I wouldn't find it as a transparency versus non-transparency issue, perhaps. The option is not related to transparency necessarily, the way.
I would agree.
No, please, Stephane.
No, so I would agree with you. Zoom can give a false sense of transparency, right? And so it could be good or bad, but I think it can give a false impression that we're being more transparent because everything's being done on Zoom. The point is, there's still side conversations being had. We just find other ways to skirt the transparency. We don't. One could.
We have a question from, in full transparency, a dear friend, Christy Edwards, who's with the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Poland. Thanks for tuning in, despite the time difference. And it maybe builds a little bit on what we were just discussing. Often we can leverage conversations with other sectors to provide us the information and insights. So for embassies and multilateral organizations, have we been able to maintain conversations and access to civil society organizations who often provide information about the issues facing communities? So I open that up to any of you here, but how has it been working? And Violet, you touched on the very fundamental role of elections. How have been our interactions with civil society organizations in this era?
Well, maybe I can sort of say that, from my perspective, sitting here in Washington, D.C., I think civil society, academia, think tanks have adapted quite quickly to the changed circumstances. So interactions through the Zoom diplomacy have actually made it easier to attend lectures, to talk to people. You can squeeze things in. You know, sometimes you sit at the computer for 5 hours straight, listening to all kinds of interesting discussions, and you get involved. And I think civil society has been part of that. Think tanks, like I said, and the academia. So this makes it easier for us to congregate from various distances to talk about things and share information that is in the open. So that has been one of the good things that we can point to in this respect, I think.
Yeah, I think for in terms of the way we work at the UN, it kind of has the opposite effect. Just I think the way I described journalists and their lack of access, the same can be said of civil society, which, you know, most of the big human rights group or other civil society organizations have UN representatives who also have access to the building, who also have the ability to buttonhole diplomats to have informal discussions. So the loss of the biosphere also impacts civil society organizations as well as journalists.
But if you allow me, I agree with him. And as far as civil society groups on specific issues are concerned, the audience is much larger now. Because as we used to do an event at the embassy, of course, sometimes we did streaming, but these days we've had events on, well, the LGBT month in Washington, D.C., or a specific cycle for women empowerment last March. And it was amazing because we had interested people not only from the United States, which is our main interlocutor, or Argentina, but some other countries. And that was something unprecedented. We hadn't had that experience before. And we still had Zoom or these digital platforms, but we were not aware of how useful they could be. So that's a very positive, actually, impact of this.
And I can give you an example of how going online, it's not a civil society interaction, but it tells you, what we can do and how things can change the dynamics with going online. The Nordic embassies here in Washington, D.C. have an annual Nordic Jazz Festival. Beautiful festival. We had it for many years. We have events at the embassies. You have a couple of hundred people who come and listen to our, the nice musicians from the Nordic countries. We weren't able to do this year. So we went online. So instead of the couple of hundred people being able to enjoy and sort of experience the Icelandic music, we had tens of thousands of people tuning into the concerts online. So the audience was much greater, and that sort of because everybody is stuck at home, stuck at the computer. There is, you're not roaming around. Everybody is in the same situation. So that the audience is a captive audience to a degree that you can tune into. So under the circumstances, I think that has been one benefit. It has been a force multiplier in many ways. In this example, in the cultural sphere.
I would just add from the small corner of higher ed that I sit in, that it's given us here in Princeton an opportunity to look at programming that stretches across or involves partners from across our partners in New Jersey higher ed, and to create conversations and interactions that we normally may not have thought of when it was just all about having people come to a campus kind of tucked away in the countryside here. So that's been a good projection of kind of our expertise, but also sort of the values and priorities that we see that are being tested at this time across education, and sharing that conversation with schools that we might not normally partner with, which has been a lot of fun. If I can, and I know we're reaching near our time, though I'm hoping the panelists will indulge for a couple extra minutes. Violet, I wanted to bring a question to you, because I know one of the important facets of your job is to deal with the diaspora of Malawi here in the United States. This has been a tough time, whatever your nationality. And one of your jobs is, I think, often involves providing support. Stephane talked about being managers and offering support to our teams. This takes it another step. Would you mind discussing that a little bit for us, and how you've had to grapple with that challenge?
Yeah, first, the Malawi diaspora has really been engaged with people back home. And in this era, there's been a lot of deaths going on. So it's the diaspora here who have to help through remittances, but also they have been asking for support in various ways. And it's has really taken a toll on the embassy as a whole to support them. But it has been really an interesting space to go through with them, to engage them on whatever they needed to want to support from the embassy in general. So, but it has been interesting to see them wanting to connect with people back home. And as I'll go back to the access of internet, it has been a challenge for people back home to also connect with the diaspora here, because internet is not easily accessible with them. But emotionally, for me, it has been a challenge as a diplomat. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And I think that resonates with like I said, what Stephane had voiced earlier. And I think all of us are trying to pull together as best we can for our communities, wherever they may be. We are at time. We still have a good number of folks still tuned in. So maybe we can end with a question that Kano had sent in, and reminds us that we are organized under the auspices of the Rising Leaders Council. What kind of counsel of a different sort can we provide regarding the diplomatic landscape for young professionals, recent graduates? So that speaks a little bit to my heart, being in higher ed now, in this virtual atmosphere. So if you want to pursue a career in diplomacy or commercial diplomacy, multilateral, what piece of advice would we give somebody who's looking to go down this path at a time when the normal networking opportunities might not be there? I'll let you chew on that for a second, but I'm trying to see whose head's nodding the most. It might be Gerry's. So Gerry, let me toss for a quick answer, and then maybe one or two others. End us on a positive note.
Well, go on. Don't be afraid of digital diplomacy. Of course, Zoom diplomacy is the new normal for the time being, but personal diplomacy will not disappear. Actually, it will be very healthy that both coexist. And we have to cope with that. And it is very positive. There are many good aspects to it. Of course, the concept of soft power in international relations will change. There might be, of course, a digital divide, but also a generational divide we have to be aware of. But in the end, I think it's a very positive change, as long as we recover the traditional diplomatic codes of conduct and we can make them coincide with this new world, which opens up lots of opportunities. We shouldn't be afraid of this.
I like that. Stephane,
in true UN fashion, I will just say, I agree with what the previous speaker said.
Well said.
But I think I think the personal contacts will not go away, and I think it's a false idea to think that we will just rely on these tools to do our work. So I think the advice is double down on investing in personal contacts.
Kezia, I'm wondering, we talked about established relationships versus developing new ones, but if you're a young professional entering your field or others, what do you think about a cold call or an introductory email these days, whether to transact business or do an informational interview? How does that sound? Do you think that passes muster?
Yeah, it's something I've thought a lot about. The next generation of policymakers or people in my field, it's a little harder to start out right now, but I've also given talks to recent graduates about this very topic. And I think, like others have said, everybody is very busy, but also sitting at home. And I think always if you can get introduced to somebody via a personal contact, that's better than a cold call. But often folks are very receptive because they know that recent graduates are not only inhibited by an inability to network, but also by a deep recession produced by the pandemic. So I think very much, the advice I always give is informational interviews, and that remains the same. And I think you can do that digitally, even if somebody doesn't want to meet up for a socially distanced coffee at the moment.
Violet or Hreinn, do you want to add to any of that as a parting piece of advice for our viewers?
Well, I think I can agree with Kezia. I think in this relates basically, the same as maybe in the dating game when we were younger. Mutual acquaintances are probably a strength in this situation. Cold call, maybe not so much, but a mutual acquaintance would be helpful. And I think also the current situation, just beyond just meeting contacts, it just reminds us how being a diplomat means that you need to be multifaceted. You need to be able to jump into all kinds of situations. You have to learn on your feet, and that is true now. I've been having to move into being videotaping addresses with the ambassador, trying to learn all the different programs that we have to use, whether it's Teams, it's Zoom, it's FaceTime, it's number of all kinds of programs just for communication, but also for information sharing. You're jumping in through the WhatsApp over to OneNotes. So you have to be adaptable. And I think that's my key advice to young future diplomats. You have to be adaptable. You have to be willing to learn on the go. That's usually what is a good advice for diplomats and a good sort of attitude to have.
Mm-hmm. Violet, I see you nodding your head also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with him. Yeah, so as a young diplomat, as it has already been said before, you need to be multifaceted and also to work on your skills to fit in every situation, because you never know where you get thrown into. And especially when you are working in a way away from home, how you find your feet on the ground. And so you need to be prepared. So emotionally, physically, you need to work on how you are able to manage situation, emergencies, because so many things happen that you never get taught in class. So it's really important to be able to learn on yourself, to develop yourself, to have that skill, to know what to do when you are not even told what to do. So that is a very important thing that every young diplomat should learn.
Oh, this has been great. I think it's fodder for another session, perhaps. I'm glad to see some folks are still with us. Two parting notes. Gloria writes, how do we keep in touch with everybody? And I have not mastered Zoom enough, Gloria, to figure out how to just send you a direct message. So what I'll say is my email, and then if others, if you review requests for others, you can reach them through me, but my email is ben.chang@princeton.edu. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in. I want to thank all the panelists. Stephane, I'd like to thank you specifically for kicking us off. And of course, Meridian International, Megan Devlin, Ambassador Stuart Holliday. Finally, a closing note from our sponsor. Programs like this one today are only possible with your support. As many as you know, Meridian is a nonprofit organization that has also been impacted by the COVID pandemic. One way you can help sustain Meridian's work is to strengthen engagement between the United States and the world is by joining the Meridian Council, a distinguished network of leaders in Washington and around the country, engaging more broadly with Meridian's diplomatic, cultural, and global leadership programs. Meridian will be sending around more information about the Council and other ways to support, donate, participate, and be involved either individually or through your company or organization. I would also ask you to stay tuned for other Meridian online events. There's been a robust set already, and we're only halfway through the summer. A slate of upcoming virtual programs include a conversation next week. Speaking of the UN, Stephane and Gerry and everyone, U.S. Ambassador Kelly Craft will be joining Meridian online for a conversation next week. I hope everyone stays healthy and safe wherever you are, and thank you again for joining us. We appreciate your attendance and your support. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.